This is UI Therapy, Episode 4. Cue the music. Welcome to the UI Therapy Podcast. My name is Jake Hopking, and I'm a user interface design and development expert, online user experience consultant, digital product designer, and I'm also a keen photographer and complete coffee addict. Each week, you're going to learn actionable strategies, mindsets, tips, and tricks that will help you take the guesswork and confusion out of designing and building beautiful and intuitive user interfaces. This podcast is your secret weapon in cutting through the paralysis of tooling, framework, and methodology analysis. And now, onto this week's episode. Welcome to another quick cuppa episode. This one will be quick, not like the last one. That was probably 2 to 4 times longer than I had anticipated it being, but I didn't quite realise it would take me that long to get through my notes. Anyhow, let's get on to this week's episode. I'm going to be talking about GatsbyJS and sharing my thoughts on this JavaScript static site generator framework. I've only built one site with GatsbyJS, and that has been the supporting site for this show, uitherapy.fm. I've been meaning to try Gatsby for quite some time. I mean, I've worked on quite a few React apps over the course of the last couple of years, but never had the opportunity to play around with Gatsby. And I'd heard a lot of mixed things about it, and I wanted to, try it myself and understand how it works and find out the quirks of it for myself. Also, I had not had the opportunity to play with GraphQL as well, which I'll get into in a little bit. That's been interesting. Anyway, so firstly, I guess to get people up to speed and to share what this is, needs a little bit of background on static site generators and all that kind of stuff. So, what are static sites? Static sites have been around since the beginning of the internet, and realistically, they were the first websites. They're simply HTML, CSS, and JavaScript served statically from a server. They are not rendered at runtime, i.e., if you have a website that has its content coming from a database, then that'll be piped into a framework which will then transform the data and build out the HTML and then send it to the browser. It's just already built. I mean, you just write HTML and then you call your server, and the server will return that HTML to your browser, and that's it. There's no cleverness going on. It's just simple. With that simple definition established, you can move on to what is a static site generator. I think you probably understand what it is now without me even going through this definition, but anyway. It's a tool that generates static sites whenever you decide to run a build process on your codebase. For example, in your codebase, you may have a bunch of unstyled text files or unstyled markdown files, which you use the static site generator to inject that content into HTML templates, which you have defined within the framework. And obviously then you attach your JavaScript and your CSS to those templates. And then your SSG will output fully formed HTML pages based on your basic input. It doesn't need to be necessarily text files or markdown. It could be tapping into your headless CMS and generating your HTML files that way. But at the end of the day, after you've run your build process, you have static assets, which then you can upload to a server and serve them without needing to be connected to a database anymore. Now, the way Gatsby works is kind of essentially that way. It is essentially that. You have Markdown in my case, and then you run the build process, and it generates a bunch of HTML templates. But the difference here is that the first page, when it loads in your browser, is a bigger payload. And then once it's loaded, React takes over, and then it pre-caches all the other content within your static generated site. So that when you click around, it's incredibly snappy, instantaneous, basically, navigation between pages, wherever you are navigating to, between or from within your site. Yeah, and I guess you contrast this to a typical JavaScript framework, or just running React as a single page application that generates the HTML in real time. This obviously has a few benefits. One is speed. There's no database queries to run against a user interaction. It's just returning an HTML document instantaneously. Also, that obviously means you're using the simplest infrastructure possible. So it's just a server serving files. That's it. Another benefit is search engine optimization. I mean, every page is a physical document, so it's easy for search engines to index these things. Sometimes it's a lot more tricky to build out an SPA which allows you to navigate straight back to that resource without having to regenerate it again through user clicks. So that's another benefit. I mean, it's not a benefit against traditional hosted sites. CMS-driven sites. But yeah, anyway, that's a different topic entirely. Also security. It's the most secure form of a website. I mean, there's not open to any kind of malicious attack. You can't inject malicious code into a non-existent database. You can't break the authentication system of a non-authenticated site. So it's super safe, super simple, and super fast. So, GatsbyJS. From the GatsbyJS website, Gatsby is a free and open source framework based on React that helps developers build blazing fast websites and apps. So, yep, it's based on React. It uses GraphQL for data. Now, that's probably an entirely different topic and probably could be quite easily another quick cuppa. But broadly, it's a new system, a new standard for returning data from a server, basically. It's a query language, hence the GraphQL, and allows you to quite easily and intuitively write queries that will return data. And based on your query, you can return any kind of data you want, as long as it's been set up correctly on the server side. But the beauty here is that, for instance, compare this to a typical REST API that has a very rigid structure that has been defined. So if you hit an endpoint that's designed to give you back users, you'll just get the users. But with the GraphQL, you can write a query that will, fetch the user data. It could also fetch their profile data, their history. It can fetch multiple sources of data, multiple endpoints in one go. And that's pretty powerful. And yeah, that's default GatsbyJS. It's just built into the framework. Now, as I said, I'm pretty new to it, but I think it's pretty powerful, and it's something I'm going to be definitely exploring more. So we've got built on top of React.js, uses GraphQL for data, and uses any source for content. I use MDX, which is, what is it? MDX it's Markdown for JSX. So you can write Markdown within JSX. And if you don't know what JSX is, that is a language extension for JavaScript, which allows you to write HTML inside your JavaScript. And it was part of the original React. It's a React extension for HTML. And it's cool. I love it. So this is a pretty powerful combination. You've got the super simplicity of Markdown, but you can also write JSX within inside your Markdown. And that's cool. I love it. Great stuff. So I hope that gives you a rough idea of what GatsbyJS is. I recommend visiting the website and reading a lot more about it if you want to get much more deep into it. But the point of this episode really is to share my thoughts on my experience with it. And I'm just going to go through a bunch of pros and cons. And yeah. First pro. I love React. And writing components is a joy. And I love JSX. Great stuff. And then also, because it's built on React.js, you have access to, a massive ecosystem of React packages, or any JavaScript package, any NPM module, anything you can just import into it because it's, just works. That's really powerful, really cool. It's got an awesome developer experience, and it's probably one of the best implementations of hot module replacement I've had the pleasure of working on. If you don't know what that is, it's basically when you save your file, that can be either your JavaScript, your CSS, or SAS in my case, or HTML stroke Markdown stroke JSX. It's instantly injected into the browser. You could be scrolled to the bottom of your page, you change some text, and it just automatically updates, no refreshing. Another positive is GraphQL itself, which is a single universal GraphQL API for any data source, which in theory can provide you with a unified abstraction layer and query language to access any data, whether that be on remote JSON or local files, or a combination of these, and they can be returned as a single blob of data. It's the future, I think. It's brilliant. Love it. Another great thing is super fast client-side navigation. So when you've built your app, or when you've generated and you've built your website, navigating around the site is instantaneous. That is very cool. I mean, there's no network requests, for instance, because when you load the first page, React kicks in and prefetches all the other pages. I think I already covered this anyway, but it's super fast. It's awesome. Another pro is the plugin ecosystem, which is pretty huge actually, and continuously growing. But generally, if you're looking for something, you can find it there. And probably my final positive is the Gatsby official docs are really rather good, and their focus on providing quality tutorials is commendable. I mean, they really have put a lot of time and effort into showing you, the developer, how to build out the functionality that you need, well, that is necessary to have a functioning website, really, which kind of brings you onto the cons quite nicely. Batteries are not included with this framework. So, for instance, out of the box, the following things are not included. I mean, you have no SEO, which goes against what I was saying at the beginning of this. And one of the benefits of static sites is that they have good SEO. Gatsby doesn't have that out of the box. You have to build your own SEO component, for instance, and you have to use something you have to use Helmet, which is from the React ecosystem. I mean, there is a Gatsby version which you can use, but you still have to write the component. And there's no kind of basic blogging stuff. I mean, you can download starter packs, which have been developed by users or GatsbyJS themselves that have a lot of this functionality built in, but they're not part of the framework. You have to go out and find these starter kits. So, for instance, there's no pagination. There's no tags. There's no categories. There's poor image support, really. I mean, there's a Gatsby image plugin, which kind of works, but if you use any transparent PNGs, it kind of doesn't work very well at all. And you have to disable some of the cool features of the image plugin to get around that, which kind of defeats the point. Links are a problem. You use the built-in link component for internal links, but if you want to use any external linking, you have to use an anchor tag. So you need to, as long as you remember that, it's fine. But for instance, if you link to an internal page with an anchor tag, at build time, when you click on that, the whole site will have to reload again. So you've just killed all that beauty, that beautiful, the quick snappiness of the React app, basically. And obviously, vice versa. If you use a link component link to link to external, then it won't work at all. It'll inject that link into your URL bar after your current URL, for instance. Then I mentioned plugins as a positive, but they're also a negative because obviously most of these plugins are third party and aren't maintained, sometimes have zero to no documentation. So you might find an Instagram plugin to scrape the last 12 posts from a user's Instagram account without any API keys, which is cool. That's awesome. That's actually really quite powerful, but sometimes there's no documentation around that, for instance. So if it doesn't work or you want to modify it, then that isn't possible because all these are plugins and they're basically Webpack plugins, which are connecting under the hood into the deeper parts of Gatsby. So you can't modify them. I mean, you could create a new plugin yourself and install that based on what you find, but that's not a good system by any stretch. Yeah, I mean, it uses Webpack. I mean, Webpack is the de facto standard for bundling, but it's not exposed in Gatsby. It's under the hood, so you can't modify things. You have no real flexibility unless you write your own plugin, for instance, as I just mentioned. Another negative is the Gatsby node file, gatsby-node.js, which you use to generate pages using the create page API function. It's pretty unintuitive and unpleasant to work with, really. This is my biggest complaint, I think. It's for something that's so modern, so this framework that's so modern, this verbose and unapproachable in some cases entry point to generating files from either your static site, or either from your file system, or from an headless CMS, or wherever else you're going to get your data from. This should be the most simple thing. This should be the selling point of Gatsby. This is where it should really shine, and it doesn't at all. It's the worst part of Gatsby, in my opinion. Another thing, which is probably quite obvious, is there's no CMS, which is fine for a simple content site, which you're going to occasionally write an update or blog post. But every time you want to update the content of your post, or you've noticed a typo and you're not at your computer, you have to wait until you're back home and then open up your codebase and your VS Code or whatever, make the change, commit it, push it, log into your server, pull it, run build, and this whole process takes you probably 5 minutes, realistically, if you're at home. I know that, this is probably a stretch with a negative, but it did great on me, actually. So it's possibly static site generators of this kind of complexity and this kind of, this vein, this ilk, this JavaScript stuff, these Jamstack stuff, maybe isn't really right for me. Anyway, let's keep focused. Another one for me that has both pros and cons is GraphQL itself. It contributes to a lot of boilerplate and repetitive queries. Oftentimes you find yourself having to rewrite the exact same query in multiple components. It's a bit annoying. I think there are ways around that. I touched on something called Fragments, which potentially could get over that, but I haven't dug in a lot deeper on that. But here I have the question, why can't we just access all the GraphQL data on every page automatically? These are static pages after all, so there's no overhead for the browser and ultimately the end user, because they're only at the end of this process going to get static assets. So why can't we just have access to the whole GraphQL data store within inside every single component and every single page of Gatsby? Debugging is a absolute nightmare if you're unlucky enough to run into a problem. For instance, I spent the best part of half a day, and actually probably more, probably 6 hours, debugging not a JavaScript issue, not a GraphQL issue, but a SAS issue. And there was literally no debugging information which was of any use. It just said build failed. No output to tell me where the fault was coming from. No console logs. And I had to, systematically go through the entire codebase by disabling or stopping imports for all these things. Eventually I found it was a CSS folder, which was my last point of call. And then once I found it was a SCSS problem, I found it within probably about half an hour. But having to guess that was where it was from is terrible. Out of interest, it was weirdly a CSS variable problem. And because I'm using a fallback for gradient, if you have a variable, for instance, you can have a variable and you can define what it is, but if it's not there, you can have a fallback variable. And I had a fallback, but somehow Gatsby's SAS bundler, SAS processor, SAS plugin didn't like it. Sometimes, although everything's working in dev perfectly fine with no errors, no console logs, it doesn't work at build time and it fails silently. And again, a blank error message is the worst kind of error message because you have no idea where to begin. And incredibly frustrating experience. Finally, build speed. Really slow. If you go to the podcast website, you'll see it's a very simple site. There are currently, as of this episode, 4 episode posts, 2 journal posts, and a home page. And it takes about 2 minutes to build. And my server is pretty fast. It's an i7 quad core with... No, actually, it's not. I've got a Xeon in my server with, I think, 64 gigs of RAM and SSDs. And it takes a couple of minutes to build each time. And obviously, whilst it's building, annoyingly, before it starts building, it deletes the entire current site. I think that's a mistake with the build process itself. I think it should have a temporary folder which it generates to, and then when it's finished building, it deletes the current site and then pushes across the new, because whilst it's building, your site is down. And as a site builds in complexity, it's going to be down for longer and longer. So yeah, to conclude this and try and keep this episode under 30 minutes, I think this has been, it's been an interesting experiment for me. I'm glad I've had the opportunity to use and build a full site with this framework. It's had a few highs, but also had some pretty unpleasant lows, particularly to do with build failures and no errors and that kind of thing. I think it's a powerful platform if you have a large amount of time that is required to build all the missing functionality for you to be able to produce a fully functioning website, or for you to find the appropriate plugins that fill in the gaps. It's hugely flexible, and that is both a positive and a negative quality. For me, I was expecting a much more opinionated, batteries included kind of experience. I think that was probably partly to do with the fact that the introductory tutorial, which is based upon I think it's called the Gatsby starter kit or something like that, Gatsby starter default Git repo, gives the illusion that the batteries are included. Anyway, as I said, the guides on the Gatsby site are great, but like with most tutorials, once you start to do anything modestly more complex, you're very much on your own, and that's especially true if someone hasn't created a plugin. And you don't really want to be starting to have to create plugins to add functionality that should be easily addable, easy to integrate. It's also been my first real world experience with GraphQL, and I'm actually really rather excited to delve further into this open specification. I think it has a lot of potential, and I'm sure that the implementation within inside Gatsby isn't how it works everywhere. I'm sure there's a much more simple, much more advanced way of doing things, a much more, maybe a higher level about abstraction. I'm sure there are. And I've been looking at potentially using this to query my Django site, my personal hopking.io site. I use Django there and Wagtail CMS, and I found that there is a Django graphene package which will allow me to quite easily access my entire Wagtail CMS as a queryable data store, which is pretty awesome, which opens up a lot of possibilities for using that in React or in the front end itself, and then kind of leaving behind the Django template system, which is good. And anyway, that's a digression. But ultimately, my ultimate conclusion is there are simpler tools elsewhere. And for my next site, which I will be starting to build soon, and there'll be probably some more information on that in the next few weeks, I will not be using Gatsby. Not at least in its current state. It's just really isn't worth the time required to bootstrap and get the functionality required to get an actual functioning website built. So that's it. That's my thoughts on Gatsby. I'm sure many of you will disagree. Please do tell me what you think about Gatsby and where I'm wrong, or perhaps you agree with me, and just send me a like. Send me a like. Can you send likes? Why not? Anyway, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate you listening to me ramble on about this kind of stuff. And also, I really appreciate the feedback I'm starting to get. And it's only early days, but I've had a few comments on Twitter, and I've had a couple of reviews. I think going forward, I'll have a little section at the end of the show giving shout outs to people who say nice things or have some useful critical feedback for me. And finally, there have been a few users on Twitter that have sent me some episode ideas. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that kind of stuff. And I will certainly be taking a few of those ideas forward and doing the relevant research around them to provide the quality content necessary. For example, I had a suggestion from Jordan Hubbard from London that was asking me how much design skill, or what is the minimum amount of design knowledge or experience or expertise necessary for a developer to successfully come up with maybe not beautiful, but at least aesthetically pleasant designs themselves, or to be able to take a single mock-up that has been designed by a professional UI designer and then interpret those into subsequent sub-pages. And I think this is actually a really interesting question, and one in which I will certainly be exploring in the future. So thank you for your suggestion, Jordan. Anyway, that's it for this week. And again, thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Cheerio. Sorry, actually, there's one last little thing. I'm still running the free stickers launch giveaway thing. And I'd really appreciate you writing reviews. And I'll simply say thank you with 4 beautifully designed vinyl stickers. So if you could head to uitherapy.fm/journal/free-stickers and follow the steps, I'll be massively grateful. Thank you so much. Show notes for this episode can be found at uitherapy.fm. If you enjoyed listening, one really easy way to support this show is to leave a quick rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts, as it really helps other people find the show. If you have any feedback or questions for this or any other episodes, you can reach me on Twitter @UITherapy, or I'm @JakeHopking. Or you can send an email to show@uitherapy.fm. Thanks so much for listening to UI Therapy, and I'll catch you next time. Cheerio.